Battle stations, battle stations. We're about to come to order. I'm about to bring this gavel down, Isla. I'll tell you what.
When I sit down, they'll be quiet. See there?
Got my co-pilot.
It doesn't matter.
Representative John DeBerry's in the house. Good to see you. All right. Thank you. We'll call the 130th meeting of the Tennessee Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations to order. The chair detects a quorum, and I'll dispense with the calling of the roll. Greetings to everyone. Thank you for being here. Thanks, it is indeed. We've got some heavy lifting to do this meeting, and as we'll discuss later in our November meeting as well. First item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes of our June 2014 meeting.
So moved, Mr. Chairman.
Properly moved and seconded. Are there questions or comments or questions or comments? Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed or abstaining? Wonderful. The minutes are approved as submitted. Behind tab 2, commission updates here, and we have several. We have, and I'll dispense with the reading of this unless and until we can get Senator Kyle to return. But we do have a resolution to honor Senator Kyle upon his successful election to the Chancery Court in Shelby County. His elevation to the court, Jim, just in case you ever look back, and I know you won't, but I call it an elevation to the court, means that we'll have a vacancy here to fill. Senator Kyle, all kidding aside, served here on this body for many years with distinction. Actually, we have some work remaining even on today's agenda that is Kyle legacy stuff. This says that he served beginning in April of 2007, so for at least 7 years. And I know that you all will join me in wishing him well. Lanice, is it appropriate? Do we have to vote on it? Do I actually have to read it? Well, we should have a vote on this. I have a copy of it for Senator Henry. You're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I move adoption of the resolution.
Thank you, Senator Henry. Properly moved and seconded. And he knows that he will be missed, but as an attorney who practices in Shelby County, I'll be seeing him soon. All in favor of adoption of the resolution honoring Senator Kyle for his years of service signify by saying aye. Aye. It's unanimous. By acclamation. Thank you all very much. Yes, I could present it to him in court. No. I wanted to talk about, oh no, Matthew Owen. Matthew, where are you? Standing now is Matthew Owen. When I last saw him, he was out guarding the water. And Matthew, Lanice, do you want to say a few words about Matthew? I always like to defer to you. Welcome.
We are pleased to welcome Matthew Owen to our staff, and I hope you will make him welcome as well. Matthew joined our staff in July as a full-time research associate. He's working on several projects right now. He's working on the low-income housing tax credit project, as well as he's working on the project with Jennifer Berry on church sprinklers, and doing a little bit of work on probably half a dozen other projects as well, including wrap-up on the infrastructure report. Matthew received his master's degree in teaching from Wake Forest, and he will be, the memo says he received his PhD in history from Vanderbilt, but he hasn't completed his dissertation yet, but is looking forward to wrapping that up in December, at which point we will have another doctor on the staff.
Welcome. Thank you. Welcome aboard, Matthew. Look forward to working with you. You bet. Not in your book, but worthy of mention, sort of under old business, I want to mention and yield to Lanice in case she has anything to add, but we do have an ongoing standard audit of TACIR by the Comptroller's Office. I think we discussed this at our June meeting briefly. Lanice, I don't know if you have anything for the good of the order to say. It's underway, ongoing.
Just to bring everyone up to date, the audit covers the period of July 1, 2011 through June 30, 2013. The auditors reviewed procurement and payment card transactions and processes and internal controls, didn't find any additional work to do there, and they turned their focus to the public infrastructure needs inventory. They characterized this kind of an audit as a risk audit. It's something that's very new to us, but that was what they spent the bulk of their time on. They arrived in an entrance conference that was held in the middle of March, and they left the middle of July. We've had a few follow-up communications with them to clarify things about the data in the infrastructure inventory, inquiries about the contracts with the development districts. Looking at our staffing chart, they wanted to be sure to show the role of the commission in that, and most recently clarifying some goals, but they have not set an exit conference yet. We have no idea at this point what kind of things they're going to have to report to us. So that's where we are.
It's interesting. I recall hearing they had a question about whether we have promulgated rules and regulations, the answer to which is no. We didn't realize that we should promulgate rules or regulations like some kind of a regulatory agency, which we're not. We do have bylaws. And I trust that if they think that that's an issue that should be addressed by promulgating rules and regulations and going through government operations and everything else, we can do that. Maybe the better part of valor would be to introduce legislation amending the organic legislation to say that's ridiculous and we should just amend that requirement out. I don't know what we would do with regulations. Senator Henry, do you have any idea, as many years as you have served on TACIR, why or whether the Tennessee Advisory Commission should have regulations, whether we should promulgate regulations? It's sort of a non sequitur to me, but I'm just curious. I hadn't talked to you in advance, so I apologize. But
I agree with you, Mr. Chairman. I've never heard that. I've never heard the question raised about adoption of regulation for any reason.
Thank you, Senator Henry. Mr. Doss, you sit here as the comptroller's designee on this body. I'll recognize you to see if you have anything to say for the good of the order on this subject.
Audit is more likely to speak with Lanice or with you before they speak with me about an audit of TACIR.
I think you ought to give them steel, Mr. Doss. You sit here as their duly designated representative, and we rely on you, and you're a good man.
As I said to Lanice, audit is audit, and they are going to do what they are going to do.
Okay. Let the record reflect. Okay, thank you. Is there anything else under old business for the good of the order? We'll call it that. Okay, so move on to tab 3. I think we have Dr. Lippard today. Will be presenting to us on the behind tab 3. Cliff, how you doing?
Doing fine, Mr. Chairman.
Great.
So as the chairman said, I'll be presenting tab 3 of your docket books. This is our biennial report, which is a requirement of the General Assembly that we produce this every 2 years, thus biennial. And the report this year is structured in the same general format as our past biennial reports. The front section focusing on several key issues that have taken up our interest over the last 2 years. And this section, the issues in focus section, starts on page 6 of tab 3, and it includes the issues covered: eminent domain, land use, water utility districts, municipal boundary changes and growth policy, blight, and infrastructure. I'm just going to very quickly orient you to the format of the rest of the report, and then see if you have any questions. Then I'll ask for your approval of the biennial report. So most of the material is actually in the appendixes of the report, starting with Appendix A on page 20, where we have our accomplishments by research area for both of the fiscal years. And these are the same accomplishments which you've already seen at our June meeting last year and our June meeting this year. And then starting with Appendix B, you have a listing of publications approved or produced by the Commission over those 2 years. Also with Appendix C, staff presentations, conference and meeting attendance in Appendix D. And then starting with Appendix C, you have a little bit more on the background of the Advisory Commission for people who aren't familiar with us, and covering our organization, missions, and goals. And then even more general information under Appendix F, talking about what TACIR does. Then you start getting into some more detailed information again with Appendix G, which starts on page 29. And this is where we discuss legislation affecting the Commission during the 2 fiscal years. And this is, again, is largely a repeat of information you've already seen at our June meetings the last 2 years. And then finally, on Appendix H, you have, starts on page 34, you have a summary version of the minutes for the last 2 fiscal years. You'll see that we had several meetings over this period, and this isn't the same full minutes that you received in your docket books each meeting, but a kind of a shortened down version highlighting on the key points. And then the last thing is Appendix I, where we have a listing of all commission members, current and no longer current, that have served on the commission during this period. That said, if you have any questions.
So this is an action item, meaning that we will have to vote to approve the report as submitted. And to get it before us, I'll entertain that motion. So moved, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. McMahon. Thank you, Mayor Beats. Properly moved by Mr. McMahon, seconded by Mayor Beats. It's before us. If anyone has questions about it or any corrections, it's you know, it's amazing when you look at the summary in this form how much work the staff and this commission has undertaken, and the vast the scope of the tasks covered, and it's only going to get more, I want to say onerous, but the next one's going to be bigger given the amount that the General Assembly continues to refer here. We will look as we go forward whether we need to tighten up on our the process for referring matters to TACIR. That remains unresolved. We've pretty much tried to accommodate all members, but there are questions whether legislation that refers matters to the TACIR shouldn't be passed by both houses, for example. We've had a tendency under my chairmanship, I've tried to be accommodating to folks, but to take on things that we know one house or the other found important. You know, we may need to revisit that and see whether it needs to be really adopted by both houses before we send things here, because we only have so much staff and so many brains and so many minutes to put them to work. But we appreciate all of your hard work. Other question I have about this is what we do with it. I can't remember what the statute says, but when you adopt this report summarizing the work from the biennium, I know that it's made available online. I know that it's otherwise generally made available, but I'd like to specifically request that a copy of it be given obviously to both speakers, but to the governor. And just to make a note that I want to make sure, I think this would be a good thing to provide all new members of the General Assembly when they come in, whether it's during orientation or something else, to get them sensitized, aware of the fact that we have this body and the scope of the work we do, and this would be a good crib sheet for all of our new legislators. Any questions, comments? I'm rambling on too much. All right, it's been properly moved and seconded. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed or abstaining? Thank you, Dr. Lippard.
Thank you, Chairman.
And to tab 4. Yes. Brother Lewis, there we go. Welcome back into the well. That's what we call it upstairs, the well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Commission members. In June, I presented the draft report of the Dealing with Blight Impediments posed by Foreclosure and Tax Delinquency. And this report was prepared at the request of the Commission based on concerns expressed by Senator Kyle. And there were several questions and comments that we, of course, took into account. One that is more easily seen in the report is that we included more information about tax delinquent and tax dead properties based on the concerns expressed by Senator Kyle. And we are asking for your approval this afternoon. So, I've covered a lot of this material before. Certainly, when I'm done, I'll be happy, or as I go along, to answer any questions. The detail can be found in the body of the report. I'm going to be focused on the first several pages of the report. And as always, please ask me any questions you may have. As we've talked about before, the foreclosure crisis and the peaked in 2008. And even though that was the peak, there are still some communities, especially, that have a lot of problems with foreclosures and vacant properties. And also there's issues with some of these being tax delinquent or tax dead, as well as some that are not foreclosed on that are tax delinquent or tax dead. The city that's been the most affected is Memphis. And Memphis has a third of homes there underwater. And by underwater, we mean that more is owed to the lender than the property is worth. Clarksville is also affected with a quarter of the homes there underwater compared to Memphis with a third of the homes underwater. Foreclosure often leads to blight because most foreclosed homes are vacant at least for a time. Some very briefly, some it drags on. And the reason that's significant is when a house is vacant, regardless of the reason for it, for a time, then it becomes more likely to be neglected. And then in worst case scenarios, there can even be arson. There can be theft of metal wiring and copper pipes. There can be vandalism. And this is related to foreclosure in that many of the investors who bought foreclosed homes at foreclosure sales are out-of-state investors, as well as many of the banks that basically bought the home themselves at foreclosure sale. They took ownership of it at foreclosure sale, are also out of state, and just because they're not on site, it makes it harder to find out and keep tabs on whether the property is well kept. One of the things that we talked about in June and we want to highlight is that the foreclosure process in Tennessee is not that lengthy compared to other states. In the third quarter of 2013, it was averaging less than 7 months compared to the national average of 1.5 years. And the reason that things can move relatively quickly in states like Tennessee is that the primary means that we have of securing home loans are deeds of trust as opposed to true mortgages. Basically, the long and short of it is deeds of trust, the lender doesn't have to take you to court to foreclose on your home because the deed of trust includes language that entitles them to proceed on a foreclosure proceeding. And since most foreclosures go that route in Tennessee, there's not a lot of room for going faster. So we mentioned tax delinquency, and this is largely in response to Senator Kyle's concerns. The biggest problem that various local officials reported and that some nonprofit local officials reported are these tax dead properties, some of which are foreclosed, but not all. And this situation is where there are more taxes owed on the home than the property is worth. So if you've got one that is underwater on a foreclosure side and tax dead, you've got a real tough property to turn over and get back into someone's hands who can rehabilitate it.
Thanks. At the last meeting, I raised the Baltimore method where you pay the mayor $1, go in there, live in it, be yours. Did y'all look into that?
We looked at that in the context of what the state constitution and law currently allows. And I'm going to speak at a very general level because I am not an attorney, and I know that I'm dangerous in that area. So basically, the Constitution forbids local governments to forgive delinquent property taxes either directly or indirectly, as for example, by reimbursing the purchasers of tax delinquent properties for the payment of back taxes. The state is constitutionally allowed to forgive certain debt, to pay certain debt, property tax debt for certain low-income elderly people and certain disabled people. The issue you would run into with selling properties for $1 is the process of getting them to the point where you've dealt with the tax the back taxes. And we have done some research there, and it's our understanding that once it's property's been all the way through a tax sale and the 1-year redemption period has expired, then the county can take the property to court to get the title of the clear title to it at that time. So you're talking about, it's theoretically possible, but it would be a fairly lengthy process, and we would have to research it further.
Yes, sir.
I appreciate that. I don't. They've looked into this. They know why it doesn't work in Tennessee. I would think if we're going to continue with this, it'd be worthwhile to inquire and see what changed in Tennessee law, and if necessary, Constitution needs to be made so we can get some of this tax dead property back in the prime, not prime, but workable condition.
Point well taken, Mayor Burgess. You recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There was some legislation passed, I believe, just last year that gives our county commissions the authority to do basically what he's saying. First of all, you have to publicly advertise the property for sale, not for an amount not to be less than the delinquent taxes plus the penalties and interest, etc. If you're unable to obtain bids that are equal to that amount, you can then go back to your county legislative body and ask them to grant you permission to sell it at a lower number. Maybe it's $1, maybe it's something, just some number that you can get. So that legislation was put in place for us, I believe, even last year.
I don't remember whether it was this or last, Mayor Burgess. Representative Carter, do you? It was just this year. Thank you, Senator McNally.
Right. We did review that, and that is available. That's great.
Good. Has it so far? Has it worked, Mayor Burgess? Is it? Are you?
I'm taking it back to the commission to authorize us to sell these for a number that we will give them, that we hope we can then publicly sell the properties, but it will not be for as much as the accrued delinquent taxes and the other interest and penalties.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we were talking about these difficult properties. This isn't just an academic exercise. There are real consequences of properties that become blighted, as noted in the Commission's 2012 report on remedying blight in general. A study of blight in Washington, D.C. found that vacant blighted properties often lowered neighborhood property values and resulted in a loss of tax revenue due to tax delinquency. 2010 study in Philadelphia had similar findings that vacant property reduces market values by 6.5% citywide and by as much as 20% in neighborhoods with the most empty lots and structures. And as we noted in the draft report, Tennessee has already taken many steps to prevent and address the blight problems associated with the large number of foreclosures. This is both at the state and local level, including providing monetary assistance to homeowners facing foreclosure so they can keep their homes, counseling homeowners on how to keep their homes, rehabilitating and reselling vacant foreclosed properties, and requiring owners to maintain vacant foreclosed properties. In general, these are effective at remedying blight. Since 2011, the Tennessee Housing Development Agency's Keep My Tennessee Home program has helped more than 8,000 homeowners facing foreclosure keep their homes by helping pay overdue and current mortgage payments. Since 2007, counseling has educated more than 27,000 homeowners on their options for keeping their homes when at risk or facing foreclosure or experiencing foreclosure. Local governments can also use the Housing Authorities Law and the federally funded Neighborhood Stabilization Program to acquire and redevelop foreclosed properties that might otherwise become abandoned and blighted. They're also using a number of Tennessee laws that enable local governments to combat blight by requiring owners to maintain vacant properties and by providing grants to address blight. As we also talked about in June. In Memphis, they're trying a new approach. They have a registry of property that is vacant, abandoned, and tax delinquent. This is consistent with registries that other cities and other states have attempted. These tend to be for vacant properties or foreclosed properties or vacant foreclosed properties. Memphis is unique in focusing on tax delinquent properties. Officials in other cities report that these are very helpful in being able to contact people responsible for the property, but that there's no data that shows that being able to contact them actually translates into the blight being taken care of. There's also a compliance issue, some problems with compliance with these registries. As talked about in the June meeting, the mortgage electronic registration systems database has been made available to local government. I went on that database to make sure that I could get access to it and see what was available. And although it is available and although it is free, it's clear that not every property is available in MERS, and some local officials have reported difficulties in obtaining access to and using it. I'm going to talk about mediation next, and mediation can help prevent foreclosure by helping parties agree on loan modifications or other remedies. And these can be effective but also expensive. In most cases, federal requirements and legal settlements require most banks and servicers to modify loans of eligible homeowners. And although mediation can keep homeowners in their homes, which can help prevent blight, it can also lengthen the foreclosure process unnecessarily for those who cannot realistically afford to keep their homes. However, in areas that are really having a lot of issues and other options have been insufficient, this might be appropriate for a local area. And this is one distinction between the draft report. We had not stated that might be a consideration for cities and counties that are still struggling. Another one is requiring banks to post a bond at the beginning of the foreclosure process. It can provide local governments the money to maintain homes that are in foreclosure if the bank doesn't take care of it like they're supposed to. There are some issues in other states with getting authority to do this, and implementing it can be administratively burdensome. It's, not just getting the money makes everything magic. You have to then do all the things to get the money and manage the money and repair the property and keep an eye on the property. And statewide, since the number of foreclosures is lower than even in 2005, 2 years before the Great Recession began, staff doesn't feel like bond requirements would be warranted statewide or in most areas, but in areas that's still experiencing a significant problem, it might be something worth considering. And just for informational purposes, we've also included information about a really controversial approach, which we talked about before, using the power of eminent domain to condemn mortgages as opposed to the actual property, and then to renegotiate with trying to give the homeowner a loan that would match their current property value. But this has really been opposed by banking and various interests. That is the presentation. I appreciate any questions.
Thank you, David. Questions for Mr. Lewis? What we have here, as you're thinking about that, to my earlier point, this really is a staff report as opposed to a TACIR report, because technically it didn't come to us as a result of legislation per se passed by the General Assembly. If I remember correctly, Lenise, this was an accommodation, an ongoing concern expressed by Senator Kyle and agreed upon by the members, so we can accept it as a staff report. Subject to your questions or any changes, as opposed to having to vote on it as a TACIR report. It would be one of those, and you'll if you go online, you'll see there's a difference between staff and actual TACIR report. So, Senator Henry,
Let me ask you a question. I know we've had this before, but a staff report, is it published or not published?
it is published. It is published. It's online, for sure.
So,
yeah,
if the staff report recommends that that all women not to have driver's license. That would be the TACIR staff's recommendation, right?
Correct.
Without any action by the commission.
Unless there's subsequent action the commission feels is warranted, but without any action. That's correct.
I wonder if that's a good idea. I wonder if we ought not to rein those staff reports in a little bit.
Well, it came up some years ago, or a year when Mayor McDonald was here. I remember and I forget the issue, but the question arose: well, when did we vote on this? Did we agree to all these things? And it's very clear. You can see in the legend on the frontispiece and elsewhere that it's a staff report, and I think there's even a disclaimer included. And Lanice, you may want to speak to that. The disclaimer that's included when it is a staff report as opposed to commission action.
For those very reasons, we've tried several ways to make the difference between the two reports, the two kinds of reports, very obvious. The front of the report is labeled differently. The commission reports will clearly say commission report to the General Assembly, et cetera. Staff report will say report to the commission on intergovernmental relations rather than from them, and identified as a staff report. Inside a commission report, there will be a transmittal memo from the docket book that sent it to you for your approval. On top of that will be a transmittal memo to the General Assembly identifying it as the Commission's official position, as well as the disclaimer inside that explains the difference between the two kinds of reports. So we've tried to make them look different on the outside, have something very different on the inside, and hope that people will pick up on the difference between the two. I don't know that we have issued any staff reports since I've been the executive director. We've had such a large number that have been sent to us for commission approval back to the General Assembly. But we would be very cautious about making staff recommendations in the first place. My view is that those kinds of issues that we might pick up from time to time, particularly as a result of the interest of the commission itself, would not necessarily have staff recommendations to the commission, but more a description of options that would be available and the pros and cons of those kinds of options. Unless we were recommending that the commission take some kind of action, which for us ultimately results in a report by you, I'm not sure what weight a staff recommendation would carry.
Yes, sir, Senator Henry.
What's kept at the back of my mind is during the income tax controversy, there was a staff report speaking favorably of state income tax. Somehow it got disseminated so that people thought that's what TACIR was saying. And it wasn't. It was a staff report. Now, I'm not speaking for or against the income tax, but I think that's important.
Yes, sir. And maybe we'll give it some additional thought, and I can't remember what arose in more recent times that caused me to focus on it. I think staff reports, given all the work that goes into it, are fine as long as they're clearly identified as staff reports and the commission has no objection. Where I think about actually voting on commission reports and issuing them as commission reports is where they are the product of a statutory mandate that we do something, and they have more of the force of law, if you will. They're more advisory in nature as a result of the legislative process. Whereas these, there's good material here. The staff has put a lot of effort into it. It's available for people to read. Maybe if a legislator wants to pick up on some of these ideas and he or she use them, it's fine. But it's not an official action because we weren't statutorily required. We weren't asked to take an action. We don't have any objection to it. There's nothing. I think any member would have a right to stand and say, I don't want this out there as a staff report. I don't agree with it. We could keep it from being disseminated. Other thoughts on that? Because the staff, in sometimes when we're not putting so much work on them, they do a lot of work. I think they should always come here and give us the opportunity to review. I'd never want to see a staff report be disseminated without having been at least reviewed by the commission. But any other questions for Mr. Lewis? Okay. Thank you. That's great. Maybe we should send a copy with the resolution down to Senator Kyle.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, you just think we're moving quickly. We get to tab 5. I think we're at tab 5. And it's one that tugs at the heartstrings. Come on. Jennifer, this is just an update on the work concerning sprinklers in places of worship. And we appreciate your presentation. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jennifer Berry, and I'll be presenting the draft report on House Bill 1649 for your review and comment today. House Bill 1649 was sent to the Commission by the House Local Government Subcommittee. If passed, the bill would have amended current law to exempt single-story places of worship located in unincorporated areas without a water supply from the requirement to install fire protection sprinkler systems. And a copy of the bill is included as an appendix on page 18 of the draft report. And as you recall, at the June Commission meeting, Assistant Commissioner Gary West and 2 members of his staff from the State Fire Marshal's Office gave an overview of sprinkler requirements in places of worship and assembly, and they provided some fire statistics for our state, and I really appreciate their help introducing the topic. This afternoon, I'll give a little background on fires in places of worship in Tennessee, why sprinklers are required. I'll discuss the current sprinkler requirements and what the bill would do. And finally, I'll present our recommendation for the bill. From 2009 through 2013, there were 161 fires in places of worship in Tennessee. And that's an average of almost 3 fires per month. Property damage is on average 8.5 times more in places of worship without sprinklers than in places of worship with sprinklers. So it's on average $122,000 per fire without sprinklers and slightly over $14,000 per fire with sprinklers. While no one died in any of these fires, 3 firefighters were injured in places of worship without sprinklers. Sprinklers do protect property and people, and the cost of their installation is usually an upfront construction cost. The costs vary, of course, but a sprinkler system could cost somewhere in the range of $1 to $3 per square foot for new construction. That would not include any additional cost for an additional water supply system if one was required for the sprinkler system. The devastation of one fire could also prevent the continued use of a community gathering space, which is an intangible loss that's not as easy to measure. And for example, following a 2012 fire that destroyed the Lebanon Church of God, a church member said that the loss from that church fire was like dealing with the loss of a family member. And although this is difficult to quantify, emotional costs can be burdensome both for the church members and for the community. National data show that sprinklers in places of worship contain a fire to its room of origin in 83% of all fire incidents. And controlling and containing a fire is important for safety because it gives people more time to get out of the building and get out of the building, and it slows the spread of the fire so that when the firefighters arrive, the fire is not out of control and more dangerous. After a 2004 fire in Carthage, which destroyed a church without sprinklers and resulted in 1 firefighter fatality and 2 firefighter injuries, the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health conducted an investigation and recommended installing fire sprinklers in places of worship. That report noted that because sprinklers can contain fires until the fire department arrives, they reduce risks to community members and especially to the firefighters who are at the greatest risk. And since at least the 1980s, Tennessee has required sprinklers in assemblies. And assemblies are buildings with rooms designed for large groups of people to gather, which includes places of worship, as well as community halls and gymnasiums and libraries, just to give a few examples. And this room that we're in today is an example of an assembly. The presence of large groups of people in these types of buildings makes it more difficult to exit safely and may result in panic in an emergency, which further endangers the people inside those buildings and, again, the firefighters who are called to the scene and are there to help people get out safely and extinguish the fire. In churches, specifically church pews, a type of fixed seating, also limit people's ability to move towards exits, especially in an emergency. And people who are visiting places of worship for special events like weddings and funerals who don't use the building frequently may not know how to get to the exits. And places of worship in rural areas also have some extra risk factors. They often rely on volunteer fire departments, and the extra challenge of alerting volunteer firefighters lengthens the response times of even the best equipped and best trained departments. In Tennessee, 80% of all of our fire departments are at least 50% volunteer personnel. And if the church is in an area without a water supply, the fire department would also need to carry all of the water necessary to suppress a fire. And if that fire is large, that amount of water might not be enough. And in rural areas, sprinklers would be even more important because they use less water than the fire department would to suppress a fire. So if there was a lack of water, sprinklers would use less water than the fire department. According to state law, the state fire marshal within the Tennessee Department of Commerce and Insurance has the authority to adopt and enforce rules establishing minimum statewide safety standards for fire prevention, fire protection, and building construction. And currently, the fire marshal has adopted the 2006 edition of the International Building Code, which is published by the International Code Council, one of the two primary national organizations that develops model codes. The current Tennessee adopted building code requires places of worship to have sprinklers if the assembly meets one of three conditions. The first condition is that it exceeds 12,000 square feet. The second condition is that it has an occupant load of 300 or more. And the third condition is that it is located on a floor other than the level of building exit. So, for example, if the sanctuary was in the basement or on the second floor, it would have to have sprinklers. And just to clarify, occupant load is the number of people who can safely occupy and exit a building. Places of worship only need to install sprinkler systems if they meet one of these three conditions in the code. House Bill 1649 was introduced in response to a request from Dyson Grove Baptist Church in Johnson County to change the law because church members believe that their buildings should be exempted from the current sprinkler requirement. Dyson Grove is an example of a place of worship in an unincorporated area that is required by codes to install a sprinkler system. And in 2013, the congregation moved into a new, larger church building that they had built on a rural site without access to a water supply. The church was not built with a sprinkler system. The architect who designed it did not submit the building plans to the State Fire Marshal's office as required by law. According to the State Fire Marshal's office, the church's sanctuary can accommodate 369 people, which is large enough to exceed the occupant load threshold and require an automatic sprinkler system. The Fire Marshal's office allowed the church to temporarily continue using the building while the architect and the church members developed a plan of action to comply with code. For example, they could have modified the design of the building so that it would be below the occupant load threshold and then the sprinklers wouldn't be required. And one common way to reduce the occupant load would be to reduce the size of the sanctuary by putting in a fire-rated wall. Or Dyson Grove could choose to install an automatic sprinkler system with a water tank and pump system sufficient to support it. Currently, Dyson Grove is in the plan submittal and review process with the Fire Marshal's office. And according to the Fire Marshal, their plans do include a sprinkler system, a fire tank, and pump. And as of today, those plans have not yet been approved. Essentially, the bill would have increased the occupant load from 300 to 400 people, which would allow more places of worship to be built without fire sprinklers and allow more people in those buildings. And the conditions would have made Tennessee Building Code less stringent than the current minimum standard of safety. Because the bill only applies to unincorporated locations that don't have a water supply, most of the affected buildings would have likely been in rural areas, which, as I've already mentioned, have some extra challenges for firefighting. We looked at the building codes in every other state and found that only 6 states have exceptions for places of worship. And one of them, the state of Florida, is considering eliminating their exception. Now, please refer to Table 1 on page 8 of the report for a summary of these exceptions in the other states. And like House Bill 1649, the code modifications that these 6 states have made lessen the stringency of the code and allow more places of worship to be built without sprinklers. 2 states, Delaware and Massachusetts, actually reduced the square footage threshold, requiring sprinklers for smaller places of assembly than Tennessee does, making their codes more stringent than the minimum standard. We looked at data from all of these states and found that the data was limited and inconsistent, so we unfortunately don't have a clear understanding of the effect of these exceptions in those states. And we also spoke with a few states in the western part of the country that have less access to water and deal with lack of access to public water or water supplies on a regular basis. And these states don't have exceptions for places of worship. And we found that some of these western states actually have additional requirements for on-site water storage to help the fire department come out and fight the fire, so they have an extra water source on site to help with firefighting. Otherwise, the fire department would be relying on tanker trucks going out to these rural areas to suppress fires, and they can only carry a limited amount of water in tanker trucks. The representatives we interviewed in these states, these western states, said that fires are much worse in rural areas because of the lack of water, and it takes the fire department a lot longer to get out there, so the fires, the damage is more significant. Just to give one example, in Nevada, any new building in a rural area has to either provide adequate fire flow, which basically means enough water to suppress a fire as determined by their local fire department, or they have to install fire sprinklers. And the system for providing adequate fire flow can be any type of system. It just has to be approved by their fire department. It could be a above ground tank, a below ground tank, even a pond. They could build a pond, as long as it provides the sufficient amount of water. Architects and engineers have many choices and alternatives when they're designing and constructing their buildings. Both, yes?
Good news. We've got a question. Senator Tracy.
Great.
We were just discussing over here water source. Does the church not have any water source at all?
The Dyson Grove Church, specifically?
Yeah.
They have a well on site that's not sufficient to provide enough water for the sprinkler system. It's just enough water for...
They have bathrooms and a water fountain.
Exactly.
That's
so
it.
It's not, doesn't have enough water to provide, to supply the sprinkler system. So that...
Thank you.
Sure.
Mayor Burgess?
But they could fill a tank or a pond with that water supply from that well, and they would have the available water source to fight a fire.
They could...
Either through a sprinkler system or through the local volunteer fire departments accessing that water supply.
Correct. A tank could be filled from a well. My understanding is for a church or a bigger building, it would take... That might not be practical, because it would take a long time maybe to fill up the tank. So that's generally not a practical solution for a church. More on the residential side.
And now to hear from a real-life firefighter, Representative Antonio Parkinson. You're right.
Right, thank you. Just a quick correction. In those cases, they normally probably wouldn't fill a tank. They probably draft and go straight pumping in water into the fire. I know all of y'all got that
From
right.
the well.
Would you say that again?
In the case of standing water supply, whether it's a pond or a well, they would pump not necessarily into a tanker, but directly into the fire. Yeah.
Thank you. And in the case of Dyson Grove, the plan would be to have the local fire department fill the tank for them.
Interesting.
Great.
Thank you.
So when
I'm sorry, I didn't see Senator McNally. Oh, she wants to hear from you. No, she's not through. But she wants to know what you want to know now, so she has time to.
Didn't the architect have any liability in not bringing it to the fire commission and the church?
Yes. So the architect by law should have submitted the building plans, but did not. So currently, the architect, the Board of Architectural and Engineering Examiners, that case is currently, they referred it to their litigation section, and currently that architect there'll be a formal hearing next year. There was a consent order and the architect potentially would pay a civil penalty of $15,000. So the architect is accountable in that way.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, the architect has not signed the consent order, and so it's moving to litigation.
We have another question from our Vice Chairman, Mayor Rowland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jennifer, the number of fires you said, I believe, average about 3 a month?
Yes.
Something like that. Do you have any idea how many of those were occupied or unoccupied at the time of the fire?
I do not have that information.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I bet Holly Sammons has that. Yes, Representative Parkinson.
Thank you. Do we have any idea how many casualties in any of those fires, by chance?
There were no church members, there were no injuries or deaths, and there were 3, in that period, there were 3 firefighter injuries.
Okay.
That was from 2009 to 2013.
But the firefighter injuries, not as a direct result of not having sprinklers, though. Am I correct?
Those were in buildings without sprinklers.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir. Mr. McMahon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to make a point that sometimes in rural communities, and I was going back to what Representative Parkinson said on this, in rural communities, sometimes it's really very, very difficult to get a tank put in because grants don't support monies for rural communities that want a tank when you don't have a sustainable water source to fill that tank consistently. In other words, you can't get a tank, and a lot of times, wells just depend. Every well has its own unique characteristics, and if it's very shallow and you're having a drought, that's not going to qualify you to get a tank. And I know that from experience. So that's probably some of the reason why rural communities have trouble getting a CDBG or any other ARC or any other kind of grant like that might support getting a tank in any other situation.
A tank for community water supply?
Yes.
This would be.
You want to speak on your microphone? Use the mic.
What Jennifer's describing here would be a tank like a cistern for a residence, not a community water supply tank, but a smaller tank just for that particular building.
Right, but sometimes, and of course the church wouldn't be a good candidate. It'd have to go through the community and have to go through the county more than likely to get a CDBG. But a lot of times communities, they come and they ask their elected leaders to try to get us a tank. And by the way, can we support the rest of the community in doing that? And of course, it always helps, especially with utilities. The more people it serves, the better on your ROI. But I'm just saying that outside of a private cistern for itself, you've really got to have a sustainable water supply, and that's tough when you've got nothing but a well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Ilef. Representative Parkinson, I'm sorry. Did you want to seek recognition again? Senator Tracy.
Thank you. Just to wind up with what Chairman McNally was talking about. So the architect made a mistake and actually designed the building without thinking about the water supply and so forth.
I don't know what the architect was thinking, but we know that he did not submit building plans, and that was by law he was supposed to submit plans. And so the building was designed without a sprinkler system originally.
So
Should have had a sprinkler
this legislation, I want to get back to what you're going to tell us here in just a second. This legislation is requiring us to do exactly, I mean, what's the legislation trying to do? Require now to come in and put a tank?
No, it's
exempt them out? They want to be exempted.
They want to be exempted from having to put in a sprinkler system.
As incredible as that may sound.
I was want to make sure that's what I
Yes,
thought. So
that's what the legislation would do.
now, most of the time, as we were talking about here, if you're going to design, if you're going to build a church, you would have to have a tank or some kind of water source if you're going to be out in a rural area. And who would be responsible for filling that tank? The local fire department and keep it filled up?
They could fill it up. In the case of Dyson Grove, they were going to ask the fire department to fill that tank. So I don't know actually who would have the ultimate responsibility to keep that tank filled. I think they would have to work that out with their local fire department.
Ms. Rourke Patrick.
Jennifer, I just had a question for clarification. The architect who drew the plans and failed to submit them to the State Fire Marshal's office, did he have a rationale for choosing not to send them in? Was there something to do maybe with the occupant load or the size of it that he thought wasn't big enough?
From talking to the plans reviewers at the State Fire Marshal's office, apparently he miscalculated the occupant load. So he came up with a number that was below the 300 threshold. When the fire marshal's office reviewed the plans, they calculated that number and it was over the threshold. So that, as far as we know, is why he didn't submit the building plans. Does that clarify that?
Yeah. Representative Parkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The picture is becoming more and more clear here. So every other church has been abiding by this sprinkler rule up until this point?
As far as we know.
As long as the fire marshal's office enforces the code, and as far as they know,
Thank you. Thank you.
Aren't you glad this is just a draft report? We actually have to act on it today. No, but proceed. You generated a lot of interest here, a lot of heat. Go ahead. But
any other questions right now?
No, go ahead.
So like I was saying, when architects and engineers are designing buildings, they do have choices to meet the needs of the property owner and to comply with codes. So they can design the building so that it's under those thresholds, and therefore they would not have to install sprinklers. For the places of worship that do have to install sprinklers and don't have access to water, they have a variety of options for that water system, whatever works best for their building. It could be an above-ground tank, an underground cistern. It could be stream or pond-fed, as long as it works for them and it complies with code. And one example of a church that does not have access to a water supply is Hurricane Chapel in Humphreys County. In 2013, this church began planning a new addition that would have required a sprinkler system to comply with the code. The addition was large enough that it required a sprinkler system. But because of the church's limited access to water, its initial plan did include the installation of a system and a pump and a tank. But before that project broke ground, that congregation decided to go ahead and reduce the size of their addition so that they didn't meet the threshold, and they therefore didn't have to install sprinklers. So that's just one example of another church and how they worked with the code. I'm almost done. So we interviewed engineers, architects, fire officials who were all against making changes to Tennessee's code that would make it less stringent. These people all agreed that exempting places of worship from the fire sprinkler requirement would increase the risk to the health, safety, and welfare of community members and firefighters, and also increase the risk to property. We recommend, therefore, that the Commission does not support House Bill 1649. And I'm open to more review and comment and questions.
Okay, just batten down the hatches. Here comes Representative Mike Carter, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was at a reception recently and was introduced to a gentleman who is an executive with one of the largest insurance companies in America. And he asked me about this subject, and I thought that was odd. And I said, well, actually, we're studying that at TACIR. I would like to have your opinions on this. And I told him that Representative Parkinson actually knew what he was talking about on such issues. I would probably have to yield to him since that's how he makes his living. He made some really interesting comments that I think probably each of you can help me understand. He said, number one, he said, we have not located a fire in the past 10 years that a sprinkler saved a single person. He said what it does is it retards the fire until the fire officials can get there. I understand that. But he said, think about this. What you all have done is you've taken a small problem and turned it into an enormous problem. And I said, I'm confused. He said, our losses are mounting exponentially on damage from fire systems. We are paying out more money because of frozen, broken pipes ruining the property than we ever paid out in fire. So if we're not saving lives, what are we doing? And I just found that incredulous. And I said, well, I don't know. So my question to you is, do we have a report? I guess I could find this guy's name and send it to him. Do we have a name of anyone who has actually been saved by a sprinkler? And number two, how do we maintain these systems at small churches? Senator has been like me. Our church, how would you maintain it? How do you protect it when it freezes? And are we, in fact, creating an incredibly onerous, difficult cure to a problem he says has not existed? I don't know. I didn't have any facts. I'm here today to get them.
I would like.
Thank you.
That
Great
contact.
report.
Sure. Thank you. From my research, I don't know. I'd have to go back and find if there's a specific report documenting life saved. There are plenty of studies out there. I'd have to go back and get that information for you. And as far as, small churches don't have to install sprinklers unless they meet those conditions. And sprinkler systems do need to be maintained. My research showed that fire sprinkler systems use less water and therefore do less damage to the buildings, water damage, than the fire department would. The fire department would use a lot more water. That's what my research found. But I would, if you have the name of that contact, I'd love to get that perspective.
Well, recall that he wasn't limiting himself to churches. He was on particularly about homes, and mentioned Franklin, Tennessee, where he had just paid out an incredible claim over a guy that went to Florida during the big freeze we had last year. And I said, well, I got some good friends out in Franklin. I'll mention that to them. So I thought that was interesting. But I just don't know anything about this, and I appreciate and respect Representative Parkinson, and I'm sure when we take a break, he can educate me on this.
There's a big difference between the residential sector and the commercial. So the point with the places of assembly is that there are a large number of people in there, and so that's why sprinklers are required. It's different than a residence.
That's what interested me when he said their study showed there hadn't been a single life saved in the last 10 years. He also went on to make comments about the sprinkler companies paying for all of the officials to go to vast and beautiful places for conventions and all kinds of things such as that. So it was an interesting conversation. I told him I would ask the question, and I've done that now.
Thank you.
Now, mind you, ladies and gentlemen, I said batten down the hatch. I recognized his honor. I got two comments, and then I'm going to recognize Representative Parkinson, but Lanice wanted to make a comment, and our vice chair.
Just one thing I think is slipped Jennifer's mind. She's got so many things boiling around in there right now that this one just may not have come up. There is a good contrast that you make between residential sprinkler systems and the kind that you would have in a church. And one of the things that Jennifer has told us from her conversations with others about them is that it would likely be a dry system. There would not be water sitting in the lines the entire time, and largely for the reasons that you're saying. Obviously, if you're going to keep it from freezing, you're going to have to circulate that water, which means you're going to be spending money on electricity to keep a pump going all the time when the building is sitting empty. So typically, Jennifer, correct me if I'm wrong, they're going to be a dry system and not have water sitting in the lines.
Thank you.
Mayor Rowland, you had a follow-up?
Just to follow up to Representative Carter's statement, I would submit to you, sir, that in the Methodist Church, a lot of people are saved by sprinkling.
I knew it. I knew I shouldn't have recognized you. Wait a minute.
Mr. Chairman, I wish I had been swift enough to have thought about that night and said that. I'm going to use that someday and claim I thought of it.
That's right. That's right. Representative Parkinson, you've been so patient.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and you're absolutely correct. I was going to mention that especially where there's no water supply, they would probably have a dry system set up, and the firefighters would then pump into that sprinkler system. And Representative Carter, to your comment, there are a lot of occasions when some of these pipes, they do freeze and they blow and they pop, and there's a lot of water damage, and it happens both in summer and in winter. A lot of times, though, it's just something to think about. In situations where there are fires, where the buildings are occupied, let's say in the regular day course of business, you have people there that can attend to the fires and or remove whatever hazard is there, throw the burning towel outside or something, and so in those cases, sometimes these sprinklers wouldn't even necessarily, activate. But when you get the activations, most of the time, from what I've seen, from my experience, it has always been after hours when the property is not being occupied. So for whatever reason, whatever the reason for the sprinklers to be activated, there's no one there. So I hadn't seen a sprinkler save a life, but every time I've been involved or seen a sprinkler activated, it did suppress the fire before we got there.
Helps to have somebody with firsthand experience. Thank you. Well, please proceed if you have anything further.
I don't at this time. I appreciate all of your questions and comments.
Yeah. Yes, sir. Senator Tracy.
So the recommendation is not to endorse the bill, correct?
Correct.
Well, that's the draft, and this is the stage where we're not voting on it today, but the staff seeks guidance and our input on how we would like to see this finalized when it comes back at the next meeting for. Well, no, not today. No, not today. But discussion. But feel free to. I think you're. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Mayor Burgess.
At the probable risk of offending someone, you mentioned at the very start of this meeting that sometimes we might need a little bit more discretion on which of these projects are assigned to TACIR for their review, and I think this is a prime example of that. I mean, even if you look at the criteria that they have put in place to just single out one entity. I mean, when you look at at least 250, but less than 400 persons and built after July 1st, I just really don't think this is, looking at the resources that we have in TACIR and all the wonderful things they must do and have to do, this just does not rise to the level, I don't believe, that staff should be supporting these kinds of issues. So that's just my comment.
No, point well taken. And here again, this came from one side of the General Assembly. This was not where we had legislation approved referring it here officially. So it's at best, unless I'm mistaken, it would be a staff report. But this only came, did it not only come from? Is this one that came from the House side?
Came from the House, but we treat them all the same regardless of their source, and they become commission reports.
Well, let's go back. This is sort of going back to Senator Henry's question. when is a staff report a staff report, and when's the commission report? Because if you had just one side of the General Assembly, and we took it, you didn't, unless I'm mistaken, I have to look back. Did the Senate also pass a bill referring it here? But did it? I don't know that it passed the Senate to send it here. I think it was deferred and referred here.
The bill actually didn't pass either house. The bill was referred to us by the House Local Government Subcommittee, and that's typical.
Yes, but my point is, I feel compelled to take commission action on and make it a commission report when we have legislation passed, a bill out of the Senate, a bill out of the House, to refer it to TACIR. You know, that TACIR take action, and then we take some official action. I'm not talking about the underlying legislation that prompted the discussion. So, yeah, Representative Sargent.
But if a bill comes out of the House and Senate, it already passed, so what are we even looking at?
No, let me make it clear. So when you have a bill like Representative Hill's legislation here, and it gets amended over in the House side in committee to refer it to TACIR, then what should happen on the Senate side is the Senate companion of Hill's bill would also have to be amended to say, yeah, we agree, this should go to TACIR for them to make a commission report. So you're not voting on the substance of the underlying bill, but both sides amend it to send it here. And it comes with a mandate from the General Assembly, passed by the General Assembly, that, yes, we really want TACIR to do this, as opposed to the situation you have here where the underlying bill is taken up in the House, and the House says, let's refer it to TACIR, and the Senate never passes on whether it ought to come to TACIR or not. The bill just never advances on the Senate side. So it's a hybrid, which does two things. It takes us back to the underlying question of whether we need to be more restrictive on what we consider here and only consider things that the House and the Senate vote to send here, or I'll yield to Senator McNally.
There could be a little bit of danger in doing that because it could pass out of a subcommittee with a recommendation that it be reviewed by TACIR, and then subsequently further down the line that get taken off, and it bypasses, in essence, could bypass the committee or subcommittee system.
Yeah, I think we're on the same wavelength about it. I mean, technically, I see what you're saying. It would have to, if it did get to TACIR for a full commission recommendation, I think it would go back. I mean, I think in the next session, it would go back as.
No, the sponsor could pull it out of subcommittee with an agreement that it go to be studied by TACIR, and then renege on that at some point, either in the full House or full Senate or the full House committee.
So it hits the floor without the TACIR amendment, you mean? So,
right.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
So there's more to it. I mean, there's the procedural questions that I wanted to surface here, and then there is as to this draft and where we think we go at the next meeting. Whether I do not believe this would be a commission report that we would vote up or down. Well, we didn't do it a minute ago with the Blight issue. Well, I guess the question is, how do you define coming from the legislature?
I mean, that's very easy. It's a bill. It's a bill that the Senate and the House has.
Well, it's a bill that was filed in the Senate and the House, and one chamber voted to send it to TACIR.
That's fine.
Well, that's the question, whether that is fine or not, because the other chamber never did take it up nor vote on whether they thought it was worthy of sending.
A lot of times you wouldn't, because if you're not going to discuss something in the Senate or in the House, if it already has been recommended to come to TACIR or already recommended to do this or that, why are you going to take your time up? Because you know the fate of the bill is going to TACIR. So you as a senator is not going to take a half hour of your committee time to discuss the bill.
No, but instead you're going to take months of TACIR staff and TACIR commission members' time on something that one chamber or the other may not think worthy of further consideration, which is sort of what I'm hearing in here today about this. I mean, I get it, but that's why we need to discuss it. Look, we're a commission, and we can have this debate. That's fine. Senator Tracy?
So would we have to change that by rule, or how would that work? For example, like if a subcommittee recommends a bill to TACIR, it should come over to the Senate, and the Senate says, okay, we disagree with that. We're going to just general sub it. So therefore, if it's general subbed, it's dead. It does not come to TACIR. You should have to have both bodies approve it to go to TACIR. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm suggesting, because the workload here at TACIR has it doubled? It's increased dramatically. And
because usually what happens, if it's a bill that people are uncomfortable with, that's the easy way out. Just recommend it to TACIR, and TACIR will take care of it, instead of if you have both bodies approve it.
Yeah, and there is no rule on it. I think it's been the custom and the practice to be handled a certain way, and I think that since I have presided over the body, I'd loosened up on that to say, sure, let's consider this over at TACIR. But I think we're beginning to, it's exacting a toll on staff as we get increasing numbers of substantive issues that have to really be parsed and presented to this body. So it just, and Representative Sargent is right on what I'm saying. I think we're at risk for overwhelming the staff unless you have both bodies agree that the matter should be referred to TACIR, because otherwise this becomes the proverbial summer study thing, which really doesn't do justice to what we've got. Yes, Representative Haynes.
Mr. Chairman, I don't mean to belabor it, but are you suggesting that the entire House and the entire Senate have to pass this, that it wouldn't even be the committees? Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, I'm suggesting that we have this discussion, that if a matter is working its way through committee in either chamber, and it's determined by whatever committee that this matter ought to be referred to TACIR, that the bill be amended accordingly, and that you can put it on your consent agenda on the floor or what have you, but that both chambers agree that this is worthy of TACIR consideration and a commission recommendation. If you think that's, we're not going to resolve it today, but this is the sort of the meat of the coconut. I mean, this is what you get into, and I'll recognize Senator McNally.
Why don't you check with the Rules Committee Chairman, which you're the Rules Committee Chairman
I know him well.
of the Senate, and that'll make one part of it easy, and the Rules Committee of the House, but maybe there's a way the committee could adopt a list of measures that they'd like TACIR to look at, rather than, because I can see, an individual that, the issue might not be fully flushed out yet, and he's not ready to vote for it, and getting tagged for having voted for loosening the restrictions on fire prevention or something like that. Yeah. But see what the House Rules Committee thinks about it, and I think you're right. There does need to be some formal recognition that it, or else we get everything. Yeah, we're the catch-all for everything.
And I can't remember the subject matter, but I remember it arising for me as chair with something that Senator Haynes had. And gosh, it may have been, I don't know if it was fire service related or not, but it was something that Joe had that he really wanted reviewed, and I accommodated him, and over it came. And I don't know that that's what opened the floodgate, but a floodgate we've got. Senator Henry? Remember something he had that was...
Mr. Chairman, we were inspired by the late Federal Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations. I think it occurred under the Reagan administration, if I remember correctly. It bit the dust. I wonder if the executive director knows why.
Denise?
Yeah, and Dr. Lippard may be able to speak more clearly to this, but my recollection from having looked into it as a result of a survey that was done by a university in another state. They were polling all of the remaining advisory commissions, all of the state level ones, and in the report, in one of the reports that I read about this, what happened with the Federal Advisory Commission is the members of Congress who were members of the commission began after a time not to attend the meetings. And the meetings began to be dominated by local government and state officials. And that came to be reflected in the recommendations of that commission. And ultimately, the congressional members decided that it was no longer serving the purpose because it didn't truly represent all three levels of government, and the recommendations were not taking all three levels of government's interests into consideration, and so they took it out of the budget.
Thank you. That's very, very good reason. I've been listening to what's been said. We have to bend over backwards, so to speak, to accommodate the legislature, or they'll eliminate us. We got to show we're useful. Now, does that mean we've got to decide about sets and standpipes in little churches? I don't think so. But it means we've got to always give the impression that we're here, ready, willing, able. So, Mr. Chairman, you're an expert at these things. You deal with that.
Well, I intend to, with y'all's input, guidance, and everything. Yes, Senator Tracy.
To close out on this, I would recommend that leadership in the House and Senate would look at a procedure on bringing things to TACIR. And that y'all can work on that between now and January.
Makes great sense. Mayor Burgess?
I'm just going to go back to the report from the Comptroller's office, and when he asked, do you have rules or regulations? Maybe this is an indication we need just a few. Thank you.
Actually, in response to that, I think this is probably more suited to bylaws, and we do have bylaws. We have bylaws, and so we could adopt an amendment to the bylaws that addresses it for our benefit and future edification. Mayor Beats.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've been sitting here listening to a lot of smart people do a lot of good discussion, and I know that there's going to be a resolvement of what's going to happen. And in my small way, I understand that laws are meant to help people or to prevent things from happening or to correct things from happening, and that's what we're all interested in. And if I'm right, we've had 3 firemen injured in 3 years fighting fires at churches that don't have sprinkler systems. Is that correct?
That was from 2009 to 2013, so 5 years.
Yeah. During those years, there was 3 firemen injured. We don't know if they were injured getting off the truck or pulling hoses or on a wreck going to the fire. In 3 years. What will this law or this resolution that's going to be passed, who will it help? Will it help these firemen, the 3 of them that got injured? Will it help the insurance companies if there's sprinklers and all these things? Who benefits from passing this legislation?
The public at large. I would hate to think that your grandchildren or my grandchildren were in a church that did not go through approval and a fire got out of control and they got killed. I don't know if that chance of that happened once in 100 years, but if it's my grandchild, that's more than enough as far as statistics are concerned. So if we cannot protect the public, and someone correct me as a legislator, we have more infant death on fires, not in churches, in fire overall. I think we're the 4th or 5th in the country with death of children in fires. So we cannot protect them because we don't, there's nowhere in here saying they had a nursery with 10 kids in there and they had one person taking care of them. That one person cannot get those 10 babies out of there. I don't want to take that risk. And we do a lot of things, but that's not a risk I want to take.
Great. Antonio?
I'm not sure if I was clear on this question. Mr. Mayor, the question was, what does this legislation, who does this legislation help? Was that your question? Okay. And
yeah.
It appears to me that this legislation helps the architect.
Yeah.
And doesn't help the public at all. In one church. I was just making sure I was clear on your question.
We're talking about churches. We say amen.
Amen. Let the church say amen.
That's good.
If I could get Vice Chairman Rowland to sprinkle me, sir, I'd quit.
Thank you. My only recommendation would be that it might be clearer that your report has a negative recommendation as it relates to the proposed legislation. It doesn't just jump right out at you. But
Okay. Thank you.
thank you. Great discussion. I just love it when you all engage. Yeah, a firestorm. Oh, we can have a lot. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Good job. Great job. Yes, Senator Henry?
Mr. Chairman, one thing you might want to consider doing when we get referred a bill, if it asks specific questions with the reference. So just saying what you think of it, A, B, C, D, like that, so we'll have something specific to respond to.
Good point. Will do. Thank you all. Thanks for discussing that with me too, because and I think there was also a period with Dr. Green at the helm that if there were questions, they would simply go to the speakers and let the speakers decide. And I've got speakers who don't. I mean, they never shy away from a decision, but their workload has increased too, and it's like everybody's sort of passing the buck here. So if we can formalize it, we'll endeavor to do that here by year's end. All right, we've got y'all warmed up now, no pun intended, for Stan Shervin. Dr. Shervin, come on up here. We're got another barn burner. No, I got to get off this. A stem winder. And this is a we've got it's a twofer because you're going to start us off today, and then we're going to go overnight and come in here tomorrow with panel discussions on either side of the issue you're going to outline for us.
And yes, and today you'll notice on the slide the word sketch.
Yeah.
This is not a deep, in-depth, detailed presentation of all the various factors that all coalesce in understanding this fairly complicated question and the fairly complicated program. So I want to make sure, of course, we sent out the materials and the memorandum that tried to summarize a lot of the issues. Today I really will try to just kind of skim and sketch, hopefully so you'll feel comfortable tomorrow when you actually hear from the people who 24/7 work in various areas that are involved in the low-income housing tax credit program and the appraisal of the low-income housing tax properties. A quote from the court case that everyone should be familiar with, at least by tomorrow, that established the current method, the law of the land, as the Department of Property Assessments will tell you, on how low-income housing tax credit properties should be appraised or evaluated, the methodology that should be used, and it is basically at the crux of the bill that was introduced. Little is known about and after a while I hope you'll accept the fact that the acronym LIHTC is used frequently just to avoid repetitive low-income housing tax credit. So little is known about the LIHTC program outside the circle of affordable housing developers, the syndicators, some investors who have waded through its sometimes oblique rules to take advantage of this rather unique incentive for the creation of affordable rental housing for lower-income people. And that was a footnote in the judgment of the Spring Hill decision, which basically affirmed the use of low-income tax credits in the appraisal process. It has not progressed past the circuit court, and so that is basically the current controlling law. If we have to go back 28 years to a totally inexplicable event to understand where all this started, 1986, Republicans and Democrats, believe it or not, came together, bipartisan, and passed the Tax Reform Act of 1986, which was one of the most dramatic changes in our tax code in probably the last half century. It changed various elements of the tax code, including catching and surprising many limited partnership investors who had gotten involved in the early 80s in limited partnerships involving real estate, commercial real estate. The basic reason behind a lot of middle class, and this was not upper 1% getting involved. Every Joe and Jerry was involved, probably in bragging about their interests in some kind of limited partnership, frequently that involved apartment complexes. They threw off tax losses right and left. The primary reason for investing in these limited partnerships was not because you were interested in a for-profit, long-run deal. You were interested in the tax losses that they threw off year after year after year after year after year. Tax losses which you could fully utilize to reduce your taxable income, which then, of course, reduced your taxes. It was viewed and known for a long time that these are abusive and accomplished nothing positive for the United States, the economy. They weren't done for profit reasons. They didn't add to our productive resources. You just kept churning properties that churned out tax losses. So one of the major changes that occurred in 1986 caught lots of people by surprise, where these tax losses, these abusive shelters were ended immediately almost. And so if you were involved in one, too bad. It took you years, maybe 5, 10, 12 years before ultimately you got out of them, when you had an opportunity to actually sell them and get your money back. In the process of all the major changes, they almost overlooked the fact that part of what some of these investments went into was low-income housing, and another bipartisan cooperative effort amongst Democrats and Republicans was support of low-income housing. We needed more of it. It was recognized, and as almost an afterthought, they realized the Tax Reform Act of '86 was about to do away with all the incentives for anybody to ever get invested or invest funds in low-income housing tax credits, or low-income housing. So near the end of the act, the Tax Reform Act, they introduced the low-income housing tax credit program that basically started off initially and eventually getting us to here we are today. The major federal agency involved in the program is not HUD, is not Congress, it's the IRS. They needed to come up with some way of providing continued incentives to get private enterprise willing to invest in low-income housing. The obvious way, and the one they chose not to go or to take, was to simply contribute federal funds to potential private investors to motivate them to go into private low-income housing. Write a check. Congress did not want to do anything to increase appropriations they had to make in the future. So they took the backdoor approach. Instead, what they came up with was the idea of tax credits, which is something akin to a restricted gift card. If you put together a deal, we're going to give you access to 10 years of tax credits, which you can then use to pay your taxes. The major investor, not surprisingly today, in these types of investments are large banks. Large banks who think they're going to have no problem generating profits for the next 10-year period or beyond, and always would have use for a little gift card they can use when paying off their corporate taxes. So by incentivizing investors, which I say today are mostly commercial banks, not totally, but the biggest one group who invests in these things, they've provided them with something they can use over the next 10-year period, the tax credits that they can basically use to basically reduce future IRS collections. So it's not an appropriation today to give them money to incentivize them to get involved in these investments. It's a reduction over the next 10 years in IRS collections, which the investors will use to reduce their otherwise balances they have to pay for corporate income taxes. So it's called a backdoor incentive, but it's basically an incentive program. The program itself is widely supported. Started probably actively in 1987. The tax credits are provided by the Internal Revenue Service to each state's credit agency. The state credit agency in Tennessee is the Tennessee Housing Development Authority. So they get access to these credits. Currently, they get about the distribution or allocation of credits is approximately, in most states, $2.30 per capita, which in Tennessee generates $15 million of these credits are allocated to the THDA, which they then distribute on a very competitive basis to developers who want to participate actively in this program. Yes?
You want to turn the air down? Lights down, lights down. I knew it was either sound, air, or lights, and I didn't figure it was the first. Turn the lights down so we can see the screen there. Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
The program is very, very successful since 1987. The THDA has basically, with the distribution through competitive bidding of projects by private developers, has basically helped finance over 900 different projects. These include brand new low-income housing and rehabilitation of existing low-income housing. Total number of new units impacted by the THD program through 2012 is over 43,000 housing units for low-income households. So it is a very well-supported program and a very successful one. The competitive bidding process hopefully is done and will be explained tomorrow because THDA will be on one of the panels. Most of these projects that are successful are restricted. They're restricted income-wise to households with incomes generally lower than 50% of the median household income in the area. And the rents are restricted in addition to no more than 30% of the household income. So renters will not be required to make more than 30% of their income paid in the rent of the units that are basically being held by them. The agreement, when these projects are basically awarded, is that for the most part, they're a minimum of 15 years and most of them run for 30 years, in which case during the whole period of time, income restrictions and rent restrictions apply. This makes them a very strange type of property when you compare them to a for-profit apartment complex. So the managers of the apartment, the low-income, a LIHTC property, have to make sure that the household's income is below certain levels, and the rents they can possibly get for the rental of the units is very restricted too. So lots of restrictions kick in here, especially when you consider we're ultimately going to deal with a way of appraising these properties. They are not like for-profit apartment complexes, they're for-profit housing. So these restrictions carry over for 30 years or sometimes more, can impact the value, the market value of these things as viewed by outside potential investors in the future. So whoever might buy into these things 15 or 20 years out from now are subject to these strict restrictions for another 10, 20, 30 years. The experience with the LIHTC properties is better than the experience nationwide with for-profit apartment housing complexes. There's always, unfortunately, some foreclosures or some problems, but with LIHTC properties, it is below the norm for most rental housing the experience with most rental kind of housing projects. In general, nobody wants to allow a LIHTC property to get into trouble. They'll do whatever it takes, push comes to shove, to try to maintain that the tight finances that are associated with these types of properties keeps them alive and keeps them afloat. Tax Reform Act, again, created this type of housing. The result is a hybrid form of property that tax assessors never had to deal with until 1987, 1988. It was a brand new kind of thing that didn't fit into any kind of useful niche for them to go out and appraise it. Most of us, if you're a homeowner, are used to the basic annual reappraisals that occur every 4 or 6 years. It's a mass reappraisal. The appraisers use a multiple regression approach, and sometimes they'll call it something else, but basically they're taking the information they know about sales last year for hundreds and hundreds of pieces of property. They know they have all sorts of information in those little property cards, if you've ever seen them, about your own piece of property. They press a button, and out comes a number. They send it to you, and then it's a free-for-all. You can accept it. You can go down and fight with the assessors like many people do. And eventually there's going to be some compromises or not, and you'll have finally an appraisal you'll be stuck with on your property for 4 or 5 years, and that's the basis of the taxes you ultimately will owe. Another way properties are appraised is with the cost approach. Sometimes if you took advantage of all the low mortgage rates over the last 5 years, you'd probably be refinanced a home. If you didn't, you probably owned it outright because some of the refinancing rates were just unbelievable. You'd have to go back 100 years to find interest rates that low on mortgages that were available over the last few years. So another approach using by appraisers coming to your house from the bank, making sure that what is your house worth is they'll estimate what it costs to they'll take the land off. They always the first thing is they flip off the land and separately appraise that. And then they'll basically use their books about building costs to estimate what it would cost to rebuild your home today, and then they'll depreciate it. If your home is 10-year-old, they'll depreciate that number for 10 years and come up with a cost approach of what your house is worth. And then sometimes I believe they go in the back room and throw all the numbers up in the air, because eventually when your house is reappraised, you get one number but with lots of data. So that's something a lot of us are familiar with. Commercial properties, totally different ball game. Totally different. The total cost of a LIHTC property has got nothing to do with what it's worth. The same is true for all these casinos in the boardwalk in New Jersey. It doesn't make a difference if you spend $1 billion building this thing. If they don't come, it's not worth anything. What they do with commercial properties is they use an income approach to try to ascertain how much net income this piece of property can be expected to generate. And then they back into that a valuation based on the income and what we call a capitalization process. You divide it by a number. If you expect most properties like this to be basically generate 9% return, and you've got the return, you've got the data on the return, and you divide it by 9%, you can get an estimate of what, this is one approach, of what the property is worth to an investor who might come in and be interested in buying it. He doesn't care what it costs to build it. He doesn't even care how you personally financed it. He wants to know, what is this thing going to generate a net income if I invest in it versus the one across the street, the one up the one in the next town. You can make all sorts of comparisons when you value properties using the income approach. So the income approach basically is the common way of evaluating commercial properties. Yes.
Senator McNally has a question.
Yes.
Does the income approach take into account the tax credits?
This is part of what I'll get to. Yes and no.
Oh, that's a good answer.
If you Department of Property Assessment will tell you yes, because of Spring Hill, it's a legitimate way of valuing LIHTC properties. And they'll say that because during the first 10 years of a LIHTC property, the investors are receiving these tax credits. That's why, in fact, they invest in them. The credits are paid out in equal installments over 10 years. So in the 10th year, the LIHTCs play no further role in the current method for appraising LIHTC property. But in the first 10 years, first 9 years, they do. And this is the crux of what we'll get to, and hopefully you'll get a better feel for how they interplay into this. The new properties caused all sorts of problems for assessors all over the country. It's a hybrid. Didn't fit in. Square peg and round hole. So what happened was all the states in the country basically went through the same process where assessors, in trying to deal with these things, they had to tax them. They got private owners. Most of the private owners are limited partnership corporations, C Corps. So you can't just say it's tax exempt when you've got owners who are basically for-profit corporations. So they all went at it differently. And the result of them all going about it differently to try to come up with a reasonable assessment, a reasonable valuation, was a whole set of appeals started appearing. Usually they start at the local level. After they leave the local level, they jump a level, usually to some kind of state organization. We have the Board of Equalization, and we have basically hearing officers, and we have a process where if you want to go above the local assessor, when you appeal it, you've got someplace to go. If you're not happy with that, you can appeal it, as they did in Tennessee, to Chancery Court in Davidson County, which has a lot of tax cases from around the. If you don't like that opinion, you can appeal it to the court. You can appeal it up appeals court, which is finally what happened in Tennessee in 2003. So the problem was, how do you deal with these things? And in Tennessee, the first case surprisingly winds up coming from O'Bien County. Now, you'd think that maybe most of these cases of assessors trying to deal with this new kind of property, how do you come up with a valuation for it? You'd think it would happen in the big counties. Happened in O'Bien County. The O'Bien County assessor said, this particular property is located here, and they have a subsidized loan as part of what they financed it with. And the O'Bien assessor said, I'm going to add something to the normal evaluation of this thing to account for the fact that they've got basically a 1% mortgage loan, which is basically subsidized by somebody. And that case went through the procedure, and that was in 1992. It was more about the subsidized loan. And that was affirmed eventually by the Board of Equalization, or the judges, and basically as a reasonable something to consider as a value-enhancing factor in coming up with the value of this thing, a subsidized loan. Well, didn't take but another 6 or 7 years, the late 90s, for the big cases started coming in where the assessors in 3 different or 4 different locations started adding in part of the low-income housing tax credits as a value-enhancing factor in arriving at the value of these things. And that proceeded up the ladder. The local appeals, up the ladder to the state official appeals, and then finally, in the case of Spring Hill and 2 others, I think they blended the cases together. It went to Chancery Court, where the Board of Equalization's decision was affirmed, and then it went to the next court where it finally ended, which affirmed everything that had previously been affirmed. So the law of the land is now consideration of low-income housing tax credits in the valuation process is fine. It's the law of the land, and it's what DPA now recommends when people come to the Department of Property Assessments and guidance in how to deal with these, because a lot of local assessors didn't know how to deal with them. At the same time, other folks who were involved in the low-income housing tax credit program got concerned, because what basically happens when you can include these credits when you go to value the property is when it's all over, the property has a bigger value than without them. So what happens when it's got a bigger value, taxes are now maybe higher than anybody initially intended when they built these low-income housing tax projects, and they have a very lean, tight financial kind of squeeze on basically the net income, when all of a sudden you owe a substantial increase in the taxes you owe, especially when you never expected this increase to be there. The paperwork supplied to the Tennessee Housing Development Authority in doing these projects is extremely detailed, including all their expected expenses for operating this, the net restricted income, and they look at the restricted income, not the income like it was a for-profit apartment complex. How much income can this particular piece of property bring in if it can only charge no more than 30% of the income of the basic renters? So your income is restricted, the rent is restricted, very tight operation in terms of cash flow. So it wouldn't take much to toss it into a problem area if all of a sudden there were 2 things. One, you didn't anticipate the higher taxes, and now you're stuck with them. And 2, you'll hear from some of the presenters tomorrow that the higher taxes occasioned by this Spring Hill methodology endangers partially endangers the willingness of developers to get involved in the program. And I'm not going to get into any kind of proof one way or the other there, but that is basically what basically caused some concern early on by those participating in the industry. And not surprisingly, what happened? In 2000, we had the first bill introduced to prohibit assessors from considering them. So while the cases were working their way through the appeals process, others saw the shortcut, as had been seen in other states, of avoiding this whole problem. It was bring the legislature into it. So in 2000, a bill was introduced to prohibit the consideration of low-income housing tax credits in the appraisal process. That bill did not pass. In 2005, the bill was reintroduced basically in the same format, didn't pass. And of course this year, and there might have been more, but at least of course we've had 2000, 2005, and this year bills introduced to limit the low-income housing, to prohibit assessors from considering them. Now this particular parallel activity occurred in many states, has occurred in many states. The courts first, the appeals process. Ultimately, you're not happy with the courts. Even if you go up to the Supreme Court, you take the next step and basically try to trump the courts, which is a state law that says you can't do it. So the whole process in Tennessee followed the process that basically had been repeated in many other states. In some cases, the other states said, the courts themselves said you cannot consider it and ended it there. And in other states, basically the legislature stepped in at some point and said you can't do it. Determining what other states do has proven to be one of the most difficult endeavors we've got involved in. It's not like you can go to a book and find out the state's bird and the state's tree. To find out what they actually do in the case of most low-income housing tax credit properties, you have to ferret all over the place, either the state housing development authorities or the state property. Some cases, the Department of Revenue in some states is responsible for overall appeals of property tax cases. So it varies from state to state to state. And the number of emails and calls we've made is just unbelievable. We still have outstanding some that haven't returned and been specific enough with us to tell us exactly what goes on. But what we found is about 33 states, either by statute or by strong court cases, currently don't allow the inclusion of the credits in the appraisal process. We have 2 states that basically exempt all of these types of properties outright, which takes it off the board. We have at least 3 states that basically deal with low-income housing tax credit properties through pilot programs. They're tax exempt. Each project has to basically make arrangements with the local government to pay a certain amount in pilot payments to offset the recognized cost of local government services provided to these types of properties. So you've got several of those. You've got a couple of states, and they admitted to me over the phone, where the assessors are apparently an uncontrolled group. They don't know what they're doing. There's nobody at the state level that controls what they do. And so how do you classify that particular 2 or 3 states when it comes to do they authorize or do they authorize or not low-income housing tax credits? Who knows? There's nobody who controls it. And then in several other states, the issue is still ambiguous. And now the sad part is we could not find one state unambiguously, definitely employs the Spring Hill methodology in evaluating the appraised value of all low-income housing tax credit properties. I was hoping to find that, and we might still, because if we could find that state, then we could answer the question of, are they having problems with the program? And since I can't find this case, I can't really address that question, which of course is going to be raised, and you'll hear about some tomorrow. Then we have the unfortunate fact that we don't treat low-income housing tax credit properties consistently, even using the Spring Hill decision, because we've carved out Memphis totally from the assessors. All the low-income housing tax credit deals in Memphis are run through the Memphis Housing Authority, and they have a longer name, Education, Health, and something else, Facilities Board. All of those basically are run through as pilot programs. They are tax exempt. They are taxed based on the value, partly on the value of the property before any kind of new construction occurred. The ultimate result is any project in Memphis knows exactly what they owe for the next 10 or 20 years. The pilot payment is fixed. It's X dollars to the county and X dollars to the city. This is what you owe each and every year for the next 10 years. The level of the pilots is relatively low compared to what would be true if the Spring Hill methodology was applied to these. And I talked to some developers, and they said this is a very attractive deal in the Memphis location. And the Memphis location represents about 17% of all low-income housing tax projects over the last, since 1987. So it is significant, yes.
And Stan, could you explain to the commission how Memphis came to have that structure? Was it a local bill? Was there
state law allows the local housing authority to do things like that if they deliberately decide amongst themselves that it's in the benefit of the local area to make alternate kind of arrangements with these types of housing. And they deliberately in 2002 voted to make this arrangement available in the Memphis area.
And then that decision in turn is not subject to further legislative review by the state.
No,
correct?
it's
so
not.
It's been delegated essentially to.
Essentially, the law, I believe, at the state level allows any local housing authority to do something like this. But as far as we can figure out, Memphis is the only one who jumped on the bandwagon early, and why the deals in Memphis basically are much. The expenses are so much lower than they would have been had the housing authority in Memphis decided not to go this route. All right, I hate to get into an actual deal, but you got to understand how these happen. Example up here is what we call the predominant type of low-income housing tax credit project in Tennessee. About 47% of everything THD has handled are what we call 9% projects. And the 9% will become clear in a minute. The projects generally involve, in Tennessee, to be a winner in competing for the tax credits, restricted income deals and restricted rents, almost 100%. So if the project involves 100% household income restricted and 100% rent restricted, then basically you're entitled to a tax credit equal to, an annual tax credit equal to 9% of what we call the qualified basis of the project. This example shows a land value of $1 million, which is pretty high, relatively speaking. The rest of the construction costs show what it costs to build the facilities. The law allows these credits on the basis of the qualified basis of the property. The total minus the land times the percent that's income and rent restricted. So you've got $4 million times 100%. This property would be eligible for 9% times $4 million, or $360,000 a year in a tax credit. So if the deal goes, the developer initially has access to $3.6 million of tax credits distributed equally over a 10-year period. Now, the developer doesn't keep these because the developer wants to sell and not be involved in personally investing all that money in the project. So what actually happens is the developers turn the property into a limited partnership and then sell shares of the limited partnerships to willing investors. And what the willing investors are willing to pay to get into the deal then accesses them to the credits. So if one large bank decides to invest in this deal and it becomes a 99% owner in the property, it gets 99% of the tax credits. $360,000 a year times 99%, 10 years in a row. Now, why would they do that? The same reason anybody would do it. You've got basically a gift card that's worth $360,000 a year that you can use to pay your taxes. If you're a profit C Corp bank who expects to make profits for the next 10 years, then there's certainly a price to be paid here for that would be a deal for you and a deal for the developer. I'm not going to be willing to pay $360,000 times 10 for this, but I might be willing to pay $2.7 million to get access to $3.6 million worth of gift cards I can use to pay my taxes over the next 10 years. And that's exactly how this works. There's a vibrant market. The developers engaged in most of these projects know about the market. They, ahead of time, deal with the banks and the potential investors. They probably, at any moment of time, know what they can probably sell these, and sometimes this is called selling the credits. They know what they can sell these credits for. And then, in this particular case, let's say they get, they call it 75 cents on the dollar. If you sell $3.6 million at a rate of 75 cents on the dollar, you're willing to then buy in to this property with $2,700,000 of equity. Developer might be willing to do that. He's going to take your check for $2.7 million. The developer still has to raise some other money, but not as much as he would if he was trying to just basically finance it himself. So yes, he gets $2.7 million of equity cash from the investors. He gives them 99% of these tax credits, and he goes out and borrows the other $2.3 million, which enables him to build the facility. He doesn't have to charge full rents because he didn't have to borrow all that money to build this thing. That cuts down on the amount he has to pay in principal interest because he's got all this equity that the investors were willing to invest. So that's how the tax credits work. It's of value to C corps, primarily banks, for a couple other reasons. All banks are regulated by somebody, more so now than they were like 6 or 7 years ago. No surprise there. One of the things all large banks have to do is show their participation at the local level in helping low-income housing. One of the ways they can do that is by investing in low-income housing tax credit properties. In a sense, they get stars or credits for doing that from the folks who regulate them. So if ever down the road it comes into they might want to open a brand new branch office, somebody's going to look up the history of their participation in helping the local area with low-income tax housing. So the banks participate more than other types of categories of institutions because, one, they get credit from their regulators for doing it, and two, it's a good deal. What are banks' alternatives? Banks will get a return by doing this of about 8%. This is not a charity. Banks are doing this for charity. When you look at the numbers and you think about this over a 15-year period, they're getting a return on their investment that beats buying 10-year Treasury bonds. They give you what, 2.25%? Banks are limited in what they can do with their funds, and they have lots of funds now that they're having trouble lending out. So this is a great alternative to something that's certainly risk-free, a 10-year Treasury, but who wants a 2.25% return for 10 years when you might be able to get a 7 or 8% return by participating in one of these investments? Now, the trick comes, and I hate to get the next step, but what do the assessors do? So we know why people invest in them. Because there's a relatively competitive return available to certain investors, and the main type of investor gets some credits for it, what they call the Community Reinvestment Act. They get some credits from the people who regulate them. It's a good thing when they do that. So here is a piece of property without considering the tax credits, which are somewhere hidden back here. I'm not going to bring them in yet. All properties basically are, after a year or two, when they're finally stabilized, you want to look at the potential gross income from these LIHTC properties. In other words, you consider the restricted rents. Now, you're not going to put market rents in here that are charged by for-profits. You consider the restricted rents that come in and make some assumptions about the vacancies and the other income they pull in. Then you consider the operating expenses for running this apartment complex or whatever it is. And you come up with net operating income. In this case, it's $317,500. You then divide that by another number, which, again, you can fight over all you want, and then people go in and fight over what these numbers should be. But the approach is basically this. You divide by what we call a capitalization rate to arrive at a value for the property. The income flow you can expect every year, net income flow you can expect every year, divided by what other investors would be expecting to make annually if they invested in this kind of enterprise. And most other investors would expect to make at least 8% return, which means the property basically is worth $3.8 million to investors who might be willing to buy it. So everything here is what goes on now without a problem. This particular procedure is not an issue. However, everything in it is up for grabs when you appeal. You might appeal the potential gross income and saying the assessor's number is too high. You can fight over the operating expenses, too low, too high. You can fight over the cap rate, too high, too low. And professionals do this all the time. They go in and fight for commercial properties to try to get some number there changed to the benefit of the property owner, obviously, a lower number. All right, the kicker here is the second picture. The second picture is exactly the same as the first picture with one difference. There is now this figure added in at the bottom that's called the present value of tax credits. So where is that coming from? Well, in the background, here's what we've got. This is a LIHTC property. The investors get, in this particular case, a tax credit equal to $550,000 a year for 10 years. This particular piece of property is being appraised in 2013. It's already been out there for 5 years, 2009, 10, 11, 12, 13. So in 2013, there are 6 years left when the investors are going to get tax credits of $550,000 a year provided to them, which they can use to pay off their taxes in the next 5 years. The assessors are saying there's a value to that stuff in the following way. If something dramatically horrible happened and this investor had to get out of the deal, and I'm a potential other, I'm willing to get into the deal. I can see that there's something here I can make money out of, because if I jump into the shoes of the current investor, I get the tax credits. So that thing is still worth something to somebody. So the unpaid tax credits clearly have some value-enhancing impact on the value of this property if the current investors somehow in an emergency had to get out. And the assessors basically have used this approach. That's where the additional number comes from. In 2013, the present value of all those future 550s is the $2.581 million. They add it, and you can see that it can have a significant impact then in the overall valuation of this piece of property by including those tax credits, a measure of those tax credits in the process. That's what the bill is all about. It is a horribly roundabout way to get there, but you can see with and without, you can get some dramatic shifts in the overall tax bill that's basically owed by this particular piece of property. That's basically it, and I hated to jump around so much, but I don't think you can understand that how important that inclusion or exclusion of the housing tax credits, unless you actually see what the assessors and the DPA and the Board of Equalization says is the proper way currently of evaluating these particular pieces of property.
Questions for Stan? This is something that he knows a lot about. And
no, sketch.
Yeah,
tomorrow you've got the experts. This was the sketch.
So the first question tomorrow will be, define the Spring Hill approach, and we'll see what that. Oh, no, but it's great. It's very helpful, and it was important to us when these bills came up this year. Senator McNally.
Since the decision in 2003, has that really affected the ability to locate low-income housing in Tennessee?
That's a good question, and I don't have the answer to that. Tomorrow you're going to hear from various parties. They're going to obviously say yes. The problem is that everybody didn't jump aboard the Spring Hill decision. I mean, they all didn't board the train immediately and start applying it. So what's happened over the last several years is slowly but surely it's taken hold county by county. So in a sense, the impact has been spread out. The timetable has varied by county as to which LIHTC properties were immediately impacted and which were not. So tomorrow I think that's a legitimate question to ask is, where are we right now with consistent application of the Spring Hill methodology across the board? That would be a reasonable thing to bring up.
And the approach that Memphis had taken, I was out of the room, but didn't they forego the
They got, well, it depends on which side you're on. I guess if you're on the assessor's side, you'd say they jumped the gun and gave up they gave up an additional amount of money they could have raised with the Spring Hill methodology. Or, of course, the other side is they've made the process easier in Memphis, and more people may be willing to invest in housing, this type of housing in Memphis, because the expenses are lower than they otherwise would have been. So you're going to get two views.
But it was the city that...
It was the housing authority. The housing authority in Memphis got ahead of the ball game here. They saw the train coming down the tracks, apparently, and you might say made a fast, quick decision to avoid this type of problem in Memphis. They turned it into a pilot program with very reasonable nominal levels of pilots being paid.
But the city at that time realized they were losing revenue by the housing authority taking that approach.
2002, well, you see the problem here, the Spring Hill court case was decided in late 2003. So the question is a good one. I'm not sure they knew what was going to happen, or if someone did, who that someone might be.
Okay. Thank you.
Air Waters.
Do we have any idea across the state, are all the counties now using the Spring Hill method, or is it still sort of spotty? Some counties are using it and some are not.
About a third of the counties don't use anything because they don't have any LIHTC properties. The others, it's less spotty than it was 3 years ago. There's still some spotties because we requested information from the assessors about what process are you using. Are you including the housing tax credits in your appraisals, and how much would you lose if you no longer could do that? And we got some spotty results. So again, I think you've got some questions that need to be asked tomorrow.
Representative Carter.
First, let me say, every time he comes, I'm amazed. I really enjoy your presentations, and I understand them, and I mean that in every sense of the word. You do great.
Well, I want you to understand that this thing is so complicated that to be able to cram all that stuff in my head, I've forgotten my grandchildren's names. Because you've got to push some stuff out. There's no longer any room left.
In 1984, I represented some people called Stuckies down in Florida. And with this change, they went from flying private jets to broke to in prison for kiting checks in a 3-year period. So your description of what happened was incredibly accurate. So I really respect that. And I just wanted to say that I'm just amazed by his presentation. It just could not be more accurate. So
well, the good news and the bad news is my wife and I were caught in it.
Well, yeah. No. Let me ask this one question if I can. Do you know of any other statute in Tennessee where we restrict our mayors and our county people on how they tax property in their areas and grant someone an exemption? Would this be our first?
Let's put it this way. They could do lots of things, but if it's appealed, they're going to lose.
Well,
it's the appeal process that's basically very clear now.
Yeah.
This is the way it should be done. If it's not, unfortunately, the problem is an assessor in any county could do something, and then if you don't like it, you have to go through the appeal process. There's no fast appeal. You can't pay $1,000 to skip the local board that you want to appeal to. You still got to go through the process at the Board of Equalization or through a judge to hear your case. So sometimes the same exact issues are, of course, they would say there's never an exact same issue, but I'm willing to bet there are enough cases that have basically the same main issue, including or excluding the low-income housing tax credits, where the appeals process could probably be speeded up a little to at least get things done a little quicker.
I see how this hurts my friends sitting here both in the county and the city if we do this. My question is, sitting with Charles Sargent on the Finance Committee, do these credits going to banks result in losses which lower our F&E income?
No.
Now, because that puts us in the game.
They can use them to pay their federal taxes. They can't use them to pay their state taxes.
Well, yeah, I know that, but I'm saying and I'm not sure. I'm certainly not into tax. Does it come back where it reduces their gross income or their net income And are their F&E taxes reduced as a result of that?
The banks invest for two reasons. I was trying to sketch. They invest to get their hands on the tax credits, and they can still take the tax losses that might be generated and thrown off by these low-income housing tax. Don't forget, there's a difference between the cash flow that makes these things just get through versus the tax, the depreciation, interest expenses on borrowed money. So a lot of these also throw off losses that the banks can use also. And when you're a bank and you're paying at the 35% marginal tax rate, if you can reduce your taxable income, in other words, carry the stuff over to your bank operations, reduce your income, total bank income, you're going to be saving 35 cents on the dollar also. So there are more than one reason to invest in these things. The tax credits are probably the single largest one, but not the only one. Banks, C Corps were not prohibited like everybody else with the Tax Reform Act of '86.
Good job, Stan. Lanice, you want to give us a little preview on tomorrow's panelists and how you went about selecting those?
We've got two groups of folks. The first one is focused on financing the low-income housing, and they're going to spend some time describing exactly how these things work, how the money comes together in order to build them, and who's involved in that process, and who's involved in the partnerships, and what the responsibilities are of the different, general partner versus the limited partners, what their roles are, and I hope perhaps through the questioning what the contracts look like and how the money flow works internally and where the problems arise for them when they discover that their property tax bill is going to be higher than they anticipated. First, we have Ralph Perry, the Executive Director of the Tennessee Housing Development Agency. Those of you who were on the committees that where these bills were discussed have already heard from Mr. Perry, and he came in and spoke with staff early on in the process, and I think you'll find what he has to say very informative. The Tennessee Association of Housing and Redevelopment Authorities will be represented by Mr. Alvin Nance, who is with us today on the front row there. He's the Executive Director and CEO of Knoxville's Community Development Corporation. Mr. Nance has been very helpful to us in other projects where we've looked at issues arising for the local housing authorities. From the Tennessee Bankers Association, we'll have Mr. David Verbal. He's the president and CEO of Citizens National Bank of Sevierville. I believe he's with us in the audience today. Is that? No, not with us today. And he'll be speaking, of course, from the standpoint of the banks that are interested in acquiring these credits to become the limited partners in these organizations and how they may be, how that aspect of those partnerships works. From the Tennessee Developers Council, we'll have Phil Lawson. He's the Chief Executive Officer of Lawlerwood Housing, LLC, and Lawlerwood Housing Partners, LLC. And we have, yes, thank you. And we have spoken with staff from Lawlerwood. They've been very helpful to us also in understanding exactly how these things work from the general partner side of things. The second panel will be talking more specifically about the valuation of low-income housing for tax purposes. We'll have Will Denami, the Executive Director of the Tennessee Association of Assessing Officers, and Will also spoke to the committees where these bills were discussed. From the Tennessee County Services Association, we'll have the ever-popular David Connor, whom we all know and love, the Executive Director of TCSA. David's on the back row. Man of many talents. And from the Tennessee Comptroller's Office, we're going to have Bobby Lee. He's General Counsel. Bobby was very intimately involved in the Spring Hill case and can describe the history and the issues there from a lawyerly perspective and will be very helpful in our understanding exactly what the issues were in that case and how they were decided. And then the ever-popular Kelsey Jones, the Executive Director of the Tennessee State Board of Equalization. Kelsey obviously is extremely knowledgeable about these issues. The State Board of Equalization is where the Spring Hill case went first before it went to into the court system. They have an administrative process there. And Kelsey is extremely knowledgeable in these things as well, and I think this array of panelists should give us a perspective, should give us the broad perspective from all these points of view and surely be able to answer all the questions that you may have.
Be great. We appreciate your early attendance here today for those panelists who are present. Representative Sargent, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Spring Hill, Murray County, or Spring Hill, Williamson County? Neither? Okay. I'm just trying to figure out because thank you.
You'll have to come back tomorrow to find out which county. Yes, Mr. Chairman.
If I didn't see Mr. Shervin's the couple of pages about where you went through the numbers on what the tax credits were worth in the handout that I had received, if you could make that available to us, I think that'd be good.
We'll do that. It's up here. I've got it, and we've been digging around. Several of us have it, but we'll make sure it is readily recognizable. I think it's this one. Is this it? This one, Randy? Yeah. You bet. One other thing I wanted to tell you all about. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning at 8:30. This will just about conclude our business for today. I want to mention something because there are at least two people here who are wearing a modicum of orange, and that is good. Tomorrow, and for those of you who traveled great distances, I'm sure you don't have orange available, but it's easy in Tennessee. Tomorrow is the kickoff for something called Hunger Action Month across the nation, and we're actually focusing on the issue of, as they call it, food insecurity, hunger. In Tennessee, the whole General Assembly kicked off a nutrition caucus earlier this year. A number of you who are sitting in here today have participated in food packaging events and that sort of thing. I have a chart I'll bring you in the morning that lists the percentage of your county populations that are deemed food insecure. And pretty high statistics in a number of counties, including Shelby County. We're over 21%. A fairly recent study reveals that since 2008, the age cohort, the 40 to 49-year-olds in Tennessee who are food insecure now put Tennessee in the top 10 of states that have food insecurity in that age bracket. Children and other groups are just as insecure as they've ever been. But it's worthy of your attention and worthy of thinking about what we all can do, either as volunteers or in our churches or with our schools to make sure that kids are being properly fed and getting nutritious meal. There is some good news on that front. We can talk about that later. But so tomorrow's the kickoff for Hunger Action Month, and if you have anything orange that you can wear, it would be a symbol in support of that. You can wear it, you get a pass. You can wear the same tie twice, and we'll applaud you for that. We're working on that with Feeding America. There's a link and a website. But thank you all for allowing me that moment of personal privilege. We'll stand in recess till tomorrow morning at 8:30. See you then.